Very good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvina Vadhitamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti 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 Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvago Vihashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Om. Very good. There you are. Nice to see you all this morning for our continuing study of this brilliant Upadesha Sahasri. And of course, welcome to all the many students regularly attending this class online. In our last class, I want to pick up this thread a little bit before we continue. Shankaracharya presented a teaching that you might not have heard before, and it might seem like hair-splitting, but it ends up being of incredible importance. And that is, Atma does, and when I say this, it sounds contradictory to everything we've been discussing. Atma does not illumine your mental activities. In spite of the fact that we've used language like that many, many times, and we do so because it's helpful at the beginning. Remember, this teaching, you've heard me say this teaching is not a collection of facts like a textbook. This teaching is a methodology that moves you from a preliminary perspective to a more advanced perspective, to a more advanced perspective, leading you step by step until you finally discover the truth. And in that process, it's like stepping stones. Every stone you step on, you have to leave behind. So even the teaching that Atma illumines your thoughts is a teaching that we have to leave behind. Why? Because to illumine, we talked about transitive verbs in our last class. A transitive verb, it's an action, illumining. We've said again and again, Atma is unchanging. Atma doesn't do anything at all. Well, to illumine is to do something. So we give up that preliminary perspective. Let me put two words on the board, and which these are kind of technical Sanskrit terms, which will guide our thinking on this topic, because this topic continues in today's class. I'll use Roman letters so no one will have a problem. The usual idea about Atma as illuminer is called kartritva, agency. Atma is the agent of illumination. And we talked quite a bit in our last class, Shankara's refutation of this. We're going to also come back to that refutation in today's class. We gave the example of the sakshi, witness. What does the sakshi do? Is the sakshi involved in any way in what's happening? We gave the example of somebody who witnesses a crime. The sakshi is not going to jail because the sakshi is not involved at all. Atma is not involved at all. Remember the word we've used before? Asanga? That's what it means. Asanga. Uninvolved. So instead of agency, the commentator uses the word, Shankara doesn't use this word here, but he's used it elsewhere. Sannidhi. nearness, or I like the translation proximity. Through the mere proximity of consciousness, your thoughts are illumined. Like, if the Sakshi is in California and the crime is taking place in New York, that's not a Sakshi. There has to be proximity. So through the mere proximity of the Sakshi, witness, the seen is witnessed, and due to the mere proximity of closeness, nearness of your thoughts and consciousness. Of course, Sakshi is here, crime is here, at least some distance. The difference here, of course, is consciousness is here, thoughts are here. There is proximity, but the distance is zero, and we'll discuss that perhaps. That's not our topic right now, but we'll see if we get into that. And this idea was, thank you. Good. I keep forgetting to push these buttons. All right, good. Doesn't take me to throw off my line of thought today. So we used this, we saw this idea of sannidhi, proximity, in the end of our last class, where we saw this verse. We saw the verse already. We're not going to go through this again. But what this verse expresses, when a snake comes out of the hole, the snake is, quote, illumined by the sun. What did the sun do? You would say, kuch nahi. The sun does nothing. In fact, it's the snake that does something. It's the snake that enters into the proximity of the sun, like your thoughts enter into the proximity of already present consciousness. This is Advaita Vedanta. Okay, with that introduction, we can pick up the thread with the next verse and next metaphor. As always, as I'm chanting, read the translation and then repeat after me. Dagdaiva mushna satyayam, Dagdaiva ushna satyayam, Tadvad bodhatmanishyatam, Tadvad bodhatmanishyatam, Satyeva tarupadhautu, Satyeva tarupadhautu, Jnate sarvahivotite, Jnate sarvavivotite. So here the metaphor is we're turning away from the sun, using a different metaphor of fire. And once again, we have to use these metaphors properly, which means with an ancient worldview and not with a modern worldview. So when we discuss the sun as a metaphor, we understand the sun as a giant ball of gas that's burning, a nuclear fusion reaction and creating light. That's obviously not how the ancients looked at it. The sun is light. That's how they looked at it. And if we want to use their metaphors, we have to understand things as they understand, not according to our modern scientific view. Same applies for fire. Some of you may have learned about how fire works, oxidation reactions in some chemistry class many years ago. Forget it. Not applicable here at all. Fire is heat. That's it. There's not that fire produces anything. Fire, like sun is light, fire is heat. These are the ancient worldviews. So with that idea in mind, this will make sense. Ushnaha. Ushna actually means heat, but here it represents fire. The commentator makes it clear. So ushnaha, heat, dagdra evam. Dagdha evam. Heat becomes a dagdha, an agent of burning. And Sanskrit is a little tricky here. Heat, fire. Fire becomes an agent of burning, sattayam, in its mere presence. So we're once again looking at the difference between kartritva and sannidhi with a different metaphor. Just as the sun is not an agent of illumination, in the same way fire is not an agent of burning. It seems to be an agent of burning, but it's due to its mere presence that things burn. If you put something into a flame, it burns. What did the flame do? It's already there. Remember, ancient worldview. The heat of the fire is already there. The heat doesn't do anything. It's the sannidhi, the presence, the proximity, when you put something into the fire. And now that's the drishtanta, the metaphor. Now comes the darshtanta, tadvat, in the same way, bodhatmani ishyatam. Tadvat, in the same way, ishyatam, it should be understood, it should be accepted that it is the same bodhatmani with regard to atma, which is bodha here means consciousness. It means knowledge and other things in different contexts. Here it means conscious. So the conscious self is the same. You put an object into a flame, it gets burnt. You put a thought, and when I say put, I'm speaking metaphorically, right? So when you put a thought, let me change the language. When an object is in the presence of fire, it burns. When a thought is in the presence of consciousness, it's known. That's the metaphor. An object in the presence of fire burns. A thought in the presence of consciousness is known. And actually, we'll see that further in the next verse. But he continues now with this idea in the second half. Sati eva tad upadhautu jnate. Sati eva upadhau. In the presence of an upadhi. Remember our discussion of upadhi? So we had given a much more sophisticated understanding of that important Vedantic term. So in past classes, we've used the standard English translation, conditioning adjunct, which is almost meaningless. And then we went to the more common metaphor that we find in scripture. Cloth is an upadhi for the crystal because it makes the clear crystal appear as other than what it is. So that's a much more sophisticated understanding. But then I think 2-3 classes ago, we gave them more classical definition of upadhi. And to understand Shankara, we have to understand like he does. So he of course, Shankara uses this crystal metaphor a lot, but his understanding of upadhi was more technical. And we spent a whole class talking about that. I'll just remind you very briefly, if you're referring to the house where you live, you could say, I live in the White House. White is a quality that belongs to the house. But if you say, I live in the house over there, the one with the crow on the roof, the crow is not a feature of the house. That's upadhi. Look at the difference between the color white. Whiteness belongs to the house. Crowness, or having a crow on the roof, has no connection to the house whatsoever. It's completely spurious. I'm not sure if that's the word. Tangential, you get the point. It's not essential in the same way. So this is when we use that word conditioning adjunct, like the crow. In fact, good to remember that. Conditioning adjunct, think about that crow. So here, what is the relationship between orangeness and crystal? There's no relationship. It just happens to look orange, the crystal, in the proximity of this cloth. In the same way, what is the relationship of the crow to the house? The temporary proximity. So this is how Shankara understands the word upadhi. Sati eva upadhao. In the presence of an upadhi, jnate, things become known. And Shankara is being quite terse here. In the presence of an upadhi, and he didn't, boy, he's assuming that you really have a lot of broad understanding of this topic. What he's assuming you're thinking about is the fact that a thought is an upadhi for consciousness. Now, we have to discuss what that means. Those words are a little intimidating at first. So, like the crow is an upadhi for the house, in the same way, thought is an upadhi for consciousness. The crow has nothing to do with the house. Thoughts have nothing to do with consciousness. Crows come and go. Thoughts come and go. In the presence of the crow, you say the house with the crow on it. In the presence of a thought, let's be specific, sadness. In the presence of sadness, you say, consciousness is sad. I am sad. Look at that parallel. In the presence of the crow, you say, that's my house. In the presence of sadness, you say, I am sad. Consciousness is sad. Whereas the sadness has nothing to do with consciousness, just like the crow has nothing to do with consciousness. But in the presence of sadness, it seems like consciousness becomes sad. In the presence of orangeness, it seems like this crystal becomes orange. This is a metaphor. And Shankara reaches back to the prior metaphor, and he says, sarpe iva uttate. That sarpe, that A of sarpe drops due to grammar rules. So you don't need to know that. There's one good thing about grammar, and that is, it's really, Sanskrit grammar is, I have to say, it's really complicated. So what is a good thing about it? If your teacher knows grammar properly, you don't have to. That's the good thing. Okay. Save you the trouble. So the example here, sarpe iva uttate, prior example. When the snake is in the presence of the sun takes on the role of illuminer, revealer. We discussed that quite a bit in our prior class. If there's no snake, if a snake is still in the hole, you can't call the sun the illuminer of a snake, because it's not illumining the snake. So in the same way, in the presence of sadness, in the mind, you say, I am sad, consciousness is sad. But in the absence of sadness, consciousness is just consciousness, unchanging consciousness. Okay. By the way, I think at the end of the last class, I pointed to the fact that this is not a this is not properly understood. This topic is not something theoretical or abstract or hair-splitting, even though it may look like that on the surface. I think the example of sadness is a good example, but I wrote down a few more. In the presence of an upadhi, identification takes place. Actually, that's a good way of putting it. In the presence of an upadhi, identification takes place. When your physical body is in the presence of consciousness, it's possible to say, I am this rapidly aging body. How's that? When consciousness is in the presence of prana, life force, then you can use words like, I am tired. But that's only because consciousness is in the presence. So these are tangential. The body is like the crow, tangential to atma. Breathing, prana, and all your life force, tangential to prana. If you say, I am identification with organs of action, like speech. When you say, I am talking too much, atma doesn't talk. So it's identification with that faculty of speech. If you say, I am the seer, or I am the thinker, these are all examples of identification. And we won't go back to this topic, but identification leads to suffering. You identify with the sadness, you suffer. So, and this identification is due to upadhi. Let's continue. Jnata yatnopi tadvadnyaha, jnata yatnopi tadvadnyaha, karta brahmakavat bhavet, karta brahmakavat bhavet, swarupena swayam natma, swarupena swayam natma, Gneyo gneyo tavatataha, gneyo gneyo tavatataha. Jnata ayatnaha api jnaha. Jnaha. I wanted to make the language a little bit more clear for you. When consciousness reveals your thoughts, does it have to work really hard to do that? Does consciousness get, especially when you have so many thoughts going on, does consciousness get tired? Or if your thoughts are very unpleasant, does consciousness say, turn it off? Give me a break, so to speak. You know, you get the point. Uninvolved, unattached, asanga, that idea. And that's what he's talking about here, that jnaha, conscious, and here jnaha means consciousness, atma. So consciousness, jnata ayatnaha api. Consciousness becomes jnata, knower, ayatnaha api, without making any effort. So when you were a student, in order to know advanced mathematics or whatever you were studying, took a lot of effort. I remember calculus classes. They break your head. So took a lot of effort to know all of that. How much effort does consciousness exert to know what's happening in your mind right now? That's the distinction. Without any effort whatsoever, consciousness assumes that role of knower and reveals whatever's happening in your mind. Tadvat, and in the same way, atma becomes karta, agent of action. So jnata is agent of knowledge. Karta is agent of action. For example, if you say, I came to class today. Consciousness came to class today? In fact, the irony from the standpoint of Advaita Vedanta, Atma's already here. Atma didn't need to come to class today. It's already everywhere. But there's still that sense, I came to class today. There is a karta there, an agent of action. In particular, a willful agent of action. The agent of decision-making. The agent of decision-making, we've talked about this many times, is a mental feature. Ego, what we call ego in a technical sense. So Atma doesn't, that sounds funny, Atma doesn't know anything. Atma doesn't do anything, but in the presence of objects, objects become known. And Atma, because of those upadhis, objects known are upadhis, like thoughts are upadhis. In the presence of objects, Atma assumes the status, actually it doesn't assume, you attribute the status of knower to Atma in the presence of thoughts. And when a decision-making process takes place in your mind, you assume the agency of that decision-making process to Atma. Atma didn't choose to come here for class. Okay. And Shankara gives yet another metaphor. Do you get the idea that Shankara likes metaphors? Do you think that rubbed off on me, perhaps? It's widely used in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. And I think the reason for that is these teachings are admittedly subtle and sometimes very difficult to grasp. And you know the expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words. A metaphor is a kind of picture. Not physically a picture, but it serves the same purpose as a picture. You get the big view very easily and quickly by use of a metaphor. So here's Shankara's next metaphor. He says, and he's illustrating the sense of karta, agency. Let me put it like this. Did Atma make you come to class? And of course that sounds very odd, but if Atma didn't exist, and this is, they call this contrary hypothesis, I bore you with too much detail. So obviously Atma cannot not exist, but allow me to use this concept. If Atma didn't make you come to class, but if Atma didn't exist, there'd be no one to come to class. So the point is, Atma has some role. It's not that Atma is crossed out of the picture. We end up with some kind of Buddhist teaching. Anatta is their main doctrine. There is no Atma. So here Shankara uses a brilliant metaphor. Again, in ancient times they didn't understand science, but they certainly understood the ability of magnets to attract iron. So Brahmaka is one of the ancient words for magnet. And Brahmaka literally means that which causes something to move. And you can imagine in ancient times how mysterious magnets must have seemed. Even today, do you know how a magnet works? Even today, it's a little, we can understand, there's plenty of science to understand it, but if you don't understand the science, it's pretty mysterious. There are invisible lines of force emanating from this magnet. What are invisible lines of... Anyway, this is the idea. Even today it looks a little mysterious. So in Shankara's time, they knew very well that a magnet causes objects to move. How hard does a magnet work to make the object move? Sannidhi. And not kartritva. Go back to those words. The magnet is not a karta, an agent of action. It doesn't do anything. But due to the sannidhi, the presence, the proximity of the magnet, motion takes place. So these metaphors describe how consciousness, and we're going to wrap this up right here and move on to a different topic. So let's make this clear. The consciousness present in your experience right this moment doesn't do anything. Actions take place in its presence. Thoughts become known in its presence. Decisions are made in its presence. Your body functions in its presence. All your mental faculties function in its presence without Atma exerting any kind of effort at all, without any kind of agency for Atma. And this is important. I will wrap this up in one more way. It's important to establish the changeless nature of Atma. I had an interesting comment on I think it was a satsang, where I mentioned that Atma is changeless consciousness. And the commentator says, that sounds terrible. Who wants to be changeless consciousness? That sounds like being dead. He didn't say exactly that, but that was kind of the sense, in that this commentator was actually put off. Atma is changeless. It looked to me like the commentator didn't really understand the teachings of Advaita Vedanta very well. But here's why it's important. If Atma changes, you are subject to aging, illness, and death. That sounds good? This is the key. If your essential nature is unchanging, nothing can hurt you. Nothing can injure you. Nothing can pull you down. Nothing can take anything away from you. You can't lose anything. This is where moksha comes from, the discovery that the language I like to use, you are okay no matter what. No matter what happens around you, you are okay. No matter what happens to your body, you are okay. No matter what happens in your mind, you are okay, because you are unchanging consciousness. So the importance of Atma being unchanging consciousness is really clear. In order for Atma to be unchanging, it cannot be an agent. Sometimes Atma is a knower, sometimes it's a doer, sometimes it's a seer, sometimes it's a think. Those are changes of condition. Atma doesn't change condition. There are no states. This is not our topic here, but we've discussed in other situations, there are no states of consciousness. States of mind, states of understanding. There are no states of consciousness. Okay, enough said. Now you might be wondering, why am I concluding this topic when we still have half a verse left? And it's because even the commentator that I use, the commentary that I use by, I think it's by one Ramakrishna, not the Ramakrishna that you're thinking about. This one lived about 500 years ago. And in his commentary, he says that in the middle of this verse, Shankara goes back to a prior topic. And when I look, so that was helpful to me, because I was wondering what in the world is going on here. Turns out In fact, you've all done this. You're in the middle of a conversation, and then suddenly, oh, I forgot to tell you. That's exactly what Shankara is doing right here. Oh, I just remembered. And he's going to share with us in the second half of this verse and the first half of the next verse. It's like a parenthetical statement which picks up from what he was talking about 10 verses ago. And so it really looks like, oh, I forgot. And he wants to stick it in. So what is he returning to? He says, Surupena swayam atma na jneyah na agneyaha atava. So he says, Surupena, by nature, atma swayam, atma itself, na jneyah, is not a known object. Na agneyaha atava, nor is atma an unknown object. A known object is sitting in this chair. An unknown object is my right hand. You can't see it. But they're both objects, right? Some objects are known, some objects are not known. Atma is neither a known object or an unknown object. Why? Atma is subject. 10 verses ago, that was our topic. It doesn't fit into this flow at all. It's very clearly evidence of that kind of I forgot, and I want to tell you this before I forget to tell you this. So he goes back to this other topic, although we can connect it to something that he didn't mention 12 verses ago, and that is Atma is not an known object. Atma is not an unknown object. Atma is the subject, but as subject, Atma is not an agent of activity. When you say I means subject, and when you say I did it, Atma becomes I. Subject becomes agent. But based on everything we just said, Atma is not an agent, and we'll just move on and we'll finish this aside. So this I forgot portion continues in the first half of this verse. Vidita bhyam tada, vidita bhyam tada, anya deveti shasanat, anya deveti shasanat, bandha mokshadayo bhasas, bandha mokshadayo bhasas, tadvadatmani kalpitaha, tadvadatmani kalpitaha. So continuing his, oh, by the way, I forgot this, he now links what he said before, Atma is not an known object, Atma is not an unknown object, and he gives a scriptural reference for that observation, looking at the Kena Upanishad, where the Kena Upanishad says that Atma is vidita, avidita bhyam anyat. Atma is unlike what is vidita, known, and avidita, unknown. Some of you know of our senior teacher at Arsha Vidya, Viditatmananda. That's the word, vidita, known. Vidita atma, one who knows the self, is viditatma. So that's where his name comes from. So he gives a scriptural reference, iti shasanat. Based on the scripture, the Kena Upanishad scripture, Atma is other than the known, other than the unknown. Some of you have studied that. What has that got to do with what we're talking about, Atma not being an agent? Nothing at all. So this is the parenthetical part, which we conclude. Now we pick up the thread. The idea being that Atma doesn't do anything, leading to this next kind of irony. Does Atma become enlightened? Think about it in the context of what we're discussing. If Atma was not enlightened before, and Atma becomes enlightened with the help of his teachings, isn't that a change of state? Then Atma is not unchanging. And if Atma is not unchanging, you're in for it. Illness, old age, death, the whole package. You're in for it if Atma is subject to change. So, Shankara says, Bandha moksha yoho bhasaha. Bhavaha. Bhavaha, the states. What kind of states? Bandha moksha adi. States like being in a state of bondage, in a state of liberation. He says all such states are tadvat atmani kalpitaha, are similarly kalpita, superimposed. These states are superimposed on Atma. Atma, a common question. Swamiji, how did Atma get bound in the first place? A lot of people ask that question. And they don't really understand these teachings, which is, of course, we all come from that state of not understanding. So this is not criticism, but it's a common question. How did Atma get into the state of bondage? And the answer is Atma never did get into the state of bondage. Notice the question contains a wrong assumption. If you say, how did Atma get into the state? You've already assumed that Atma is in a state of bondage. You've made a wrong assumption even before asking the question, which happens a lot. Anyway, Atma never got into a state of bondage. Atma never gets liberated. Why? Atma is unchanging. To explain this using the common language that you've heard many, many times, we've heard it said that your true nature is divine. When did your true nature become divine? You get it. This is your essence, your essential nature. Sat-chit-ananda, Atma, is your truth, always has been, always will be, and that true nature is unchangeable. That's the importance of these teachings. Then we can say, well, how did this bondage, what is bondage? Instead of saying, how did Atma get into a state of bondage, a better question would be, what is bondage? And how do we get out of it? Better yet, if my true nature is already divine, why am I suffering so much? That's an excellent question. If my true nature is already unchanging consciousness, why am I having such a miserable day? These are the right questions to ask. Right questions because they lead us very quickly to a proper understanding. If you say, if I am pure consciousness, wait a minute, do you know that you are pure consciousness? Because then you go on to say, then why am I suffering so much? Suffering takes place in your mind. Sounds to me like you're identified with your mind and not identified with unchanging consciousness, which is so common. This is normal human behavior. You identify with your body. If your body is ill, I am ill. If you have a cold and you're sneezing, and somebody says, are you okay? And he says, I'm okay, my body has a cold. Who uses that language? But isn't it the truth? And that observation shows how deep our identification is with the body and mind. The fact that that sounds strange. I'm okay, my body has a cold. But that's the truth. Or if you're crying, Somebody says, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. My mind is full of sadness." That's the truth. But due to identification, that's not our experience. Our experience gets thrown off because of this identification which is the result of ignorance. Ignorance in particular, failure to know your true nature as unchanging consciousness. So, if you're identified with your body and mind, you can say, "Why am I having such a miserable day today?" Naturally, you can say that. But if you're identified with pure, unchanging consciousness, is it possible to say that? "Why am I having such a miserable day?" You could ask a question, "Swamiji, if I am unchanging," not if. "Swamiji, I know I am unchanging consciousness. So why is my body and mind in such bad shape?" That's a very different question, right? "Swamiji, I know. I am unchanging consciousness. I am absolutely okay. So why is my body and mind in such bad shape?" And of course, I can't answer that question. If your body is in bad shape, ask your doctor. If your mind is in bad shape, ask your therapist. Don't ask me. That's not my job. But you get the point. So the problem is one of identification. So bondage and moksha are indeed changes of states. Shankara uses the term bhavaha. Bhava here means state. You have many states. You have a state of the waking state, dream state, deep sleep state, state of samadhi. I don't know what other states are there. State of New Jersey. Sorry for the bad joke. Bad joke, anyway. It made you laugh. It's good enough. Okay. There are many, many states for your body and mind. There are no states of consciousness. Consciousness is unchanging. Therefore, bondage and moksha, bandha and moksha, are states of mind. Clearly, they're states of your mind. If your mind, due to ignorance of your true nature, if there is identification with your body and mind, and please note this, the locus of ignorance is where? In the mind, right? The locus of the problem of identification, false identification with your body and mind, the locus of that false identification is where? In your mind. If the problem is in your mind, where should the solution take place? I've quoted before that famous statement, "Mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha mokshayoho." The mind alone is the cause for your bondage and your liberation. Shankara concludes this in the next verse. Nahoratre tata surye, nahoratre tata surye, prabharupa visheshataha, prabharupa visheshataha, bodharupa visheshana, bodharupa visheshana, bodha bodhau tatatmani, bodha bodhau tatatmani. Start at the end. Bodha abodhau. Knowledge and ignorance. Knowledge and ignorance, na atmani, don't belong to atma. Pretty clear based on what we've just discussed. Atma is the consciousness because of which you know. Are you enlightened yet? If I ask you the question, are you enlightened yet? You might answer yes, you might answer no, but how do you know? So you go through a process of introspection when you hear my question, are you enlightened yet? What are you introspecting? Right? What's going on in my mind? And whatever's going on in your mind is known to you. And that's what he says, Bodha Rupa Avisheshat. Because Bodha Rupa Avishesha means nothing else. Atma is Bodha Rupa, and this is tricky. So we have Bodha in this last line. Bodha, knowledge, Abodha, ignorance, and then in the third line, Bodha meaning consciousness. Words have different meanings in different contexts. Be ready for that, even right in this one verse. So in the last line, Bodha and Abodha mean knowledge and ignorance. In the third line, Bodha means consciousness. And if you say, why is Shankara using this what is the word I'm looking for? Unclear language, this ambiguous, that's the word, ambiguous language, not ambiguous to Shankara, and not ambiguous to anyone who knows a little Sanskrit and who knows Shankara very well. It may look ambiguous at first, but when you get the hang of it, so to speak, it's not ambiguous at all. Okay, so he says, Bodha Rupa Avisheshat, because Atma is nothing but consciousness, unchanging consciousness, therefore Bodha Abodha na Atmani. Bodha and Abodha, knowledge and ignorance, or better said, moksha and bandha, enlightenment and bondage, do not belong to Atma. If you ask, to whom and there's a famous question, Shankara himself says, then to whom do bondage and moksha belong? We've already established they're states of mind. So Shankara, instead of getting into a long discourse about who suffers bondage and who gets enlightened, so Shankara answers the question, gives you this. Shankara has a style of giving you a one-word answer, and then maybe or maybe not, you get a more elaborate answer after that. So if you ask Shankara, who is it that experiences bondage and gets enlightened, or the Sanskrit terms actually translate more as, for whom are bondage and liberation? And Shankara's one-word answer, Prishtuhu, for the one who's asking the question. That's it. And it's a perfect answer. Whoever is asking the question, that's it. Okay. And then he gives one more metaphor. How many metaphors? So one more metaphor. He says, na ahoratre yatha. You see the tata in the last line connects to yatha in the first line. This is how Sanskrit grammar works. Just like Surya with regard to the sun. Na ahaha and ratra. There is no day or night for the sun. That might be a little obscure unless we just substitute some language. There is no sunrise or sunset. Every morning, what does the sun do? It's just there. Remember, it's the earth turning on its axis. Every evening, what does the sun do? Nothing. They're just sitting there. It goes back to that snake example. It's the snake that moves. It's the snake that enters into proximity to the sun. The motion belongs to the snake, not to the sun. In the same way, when we talk about sunset and sunrise, what's moving? not the sun. What a brilliant metaphor. And that's what Shankara says here. There is no, and when he uses the terms day and night, but the implication is there's no sunrise, there's no sunset. The sun doesn't go up and down. The earth turns. The sun is unmoving, unchanging. Brilliant metaphor for unchanging consciousness. And he concludes, why? Prabharupa avisheshataha. Because the sun is nothing but light. Prabha, light. Prabharupa, the nature of the sun is nothing but light. Avishesha, unchanging light, unconditioned light. It's not like in the morning the light becomes brighter and brighter and brighter. The sun is becoming brighter and brighter and brighter. Again, the sun shines at the same intensity. When you wake up in the morning and you feel dull, and after a cup of tea or coffee you feel bright, did consciousness wake up dull and become bright? You get it. Unchanging consciousness. And let me leave you, we'll stop here for today, but let me leave you with this thought about again, to reiterate the importance of understanding Atma as unchanging consciousness. If consciousness is subject to change, it's like the stock market. They're subject to ups and downs. That which is change, that which is subject to change, can go up and down. And the stock market can not only go down, but the stock market can crash, as it were. That which is unchanging can't go up or down. Now, if you say, what? Can't go up? Atma is already divine. What more up do you want? Atma is already boundaryless, limitless, vast. You can't improve on that. And being unchanging, there's no down. So to discover, let me use my language very carefully here. If you shift your identification from your body and mind, and you shift your identification to unchanging consciousness, which is your essence, that's enlightenment. The permanent disidentification with body and mind, and the firm identification of who you are as being unchanging consciousness, you become utterly free from suffering. This is how Vedanta works. Okay? In the next class, we have just 4 verses left, and we'll conclude chapter 15 in our next class. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om. That's it.